The grand chamber of the Valorian Imperium stretched across an entire city block on their home world of Valora. Prime and the 7 species that formed the ruling council sat in their designated positions around the circular table that had witnessed 3,000 years of galactic policy. Ambassador Thelzon of the Valorians stood tall on his 4 legs, and his crystalline eyes gleamed with confidence as he activated the holographic display, showing a small blue and green planet rotating slowly. In the center of the chamber, honored members of the Grand Council, Thelzon began with his voice resonating through the translation devices worn by each representative. And we have discovered a new species in Sector 447, and they call themselves humans, and their world is designated Earth in their primitive language. The other council members leaned forward with interest, because new species meant new resources and new subjects for the Imperium, and the Valorians had built their power on the foundation of uplifting lesser species into their coalition, though everyone knew that uplifting really meant subjugation. What are their capabilities? Asked Council Member Zahn from the Cravathi species, and his serpentine body coiled around his floating platform. Thalshan gestured, and the hologram shifted to show images of humans going about their daily lives in their cities and forests and oceans. Preliminary scans reveal a species of remarkable weakness, Thalzon reported with barely concealed amusement, and they possess no natural armor and no enhanced strength and no biological weapons of any kind, and their genetic code shows no signs of optimization or engineering, and they are entirely natural. Evolution, and quite frankly a biological accident. Laughter rippled through the council chamber, because the idea of a species surviving to spacefaring capability without genetic enhancement seemed absurd to races that had been modifying themselves for millennia. Their technology? Pressed Counselor Marana from the Shelkuth, and her 6 arms gesturing impatiently. Crude but functional, Thalzon replied, and they have achieved faster than light travel within the last 50 of their years, though their ships are slow and inefficient, and their weapons are based on chemical propulsion and nuclear fission, and their most advanced combat vessels would struggle against our mining barges. More amusement spread through the chamber, and the Valorian Imperium commanded fleets that could glass planets, and their shields could withstand the fury of stars, and their weapons operated on principles these humans probably had not even theorized yet. They have approximately 12 billion individuals across their home world and 7 colony worlds. Thalzon continued, and their military forces number around 200 million with another 500 million in reserve capacity, and they maintain a fleet of roughly 3,000 vessels of various classes. Impressive numbers for primitives, noted Zarn, though his tone suggested he found it more curious than threatening. Have we established diplomatic contact? Asked High Counselor Vareth from his elevated throne, and the ancient Valorian's voice carried the weight of centuries. Yes, honored High Counselor. Thalzon confirmed, and we transmitted standard Imperium protocols 3 cycles ago, and we offered them protectorate status under our guidance with the usual terms and the promise of technological advancement and galactic trade opportunities and protection from hostile forces. And their response? Thalson's face shifted in what other species had learned to recognize as embarrassment. They declined, honored High Counselor. Silence fell across the chamber like a physical weight, because in 3,000 years and across 400 subjugated species, no one had ever simply declined the Imperium's generous offer. They declined? Varath's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Yes, honored High Counselor. Thalzon explained quickly, and their representative claimed they valued independence and self-determination, and they expressed interest in equal partnership, but rejected any form of protectorate status, and they were quite polite about it, but firm. Counselor Marana's arms trembled with rage because the Shelkuth had been among the first species brought into the Imperium, and the idea that these hairless primates thought themselves too good for the same honor offended her deeply. Equal. Partnership? She hissed, and they have been in space for 50 years, and we have ruled the stars for millennia, and they dare to demand equality. Murmurs of agreement echoed through the chamber, and pride was a powerful force among the Imperiums. Ruling species and the humans had unknowingly struck at the very foundation of Valorian identity high. Councillor Varath raised one long-fingered hand, and silence returned immediately. The Imperium does not make offers twice, he declared, and his words carried the finality of law. And we have extended our hand in friendship, and these humans have rejected it, and therefore they have chosen to learn the hard way what it means to stand alone in a hostile galaxy. I propose immediate subjugation protocols, announced Zarn and his hood flaring wide, and we dispatch a pacification fleet, and they will understand their mistake, and they will beg for the protectorate status they so foolishly rejected. Votes were cast quickly because there was no real debate, and the humans were weak and primitive, and their rejection was an insult that could not stand, and every council member understood that allowing one species to refuse would encourage others to try. The vote passed unanimously within hours. Fleet Commander Dravok received his orders, and he would take Battle Group 7 to Earth, and he would deliver the Imperium's ultimatum, and the humans would have one final chance to surrender peacefully. And if they refused, then Dravok was authorized to use whatever force necessary to bring them to heel. Dravok stood on the bridge of his flagship Eternal Dominion and watched the swirling colors of faster than light travel streak past his view screen, and he commanded 47 warships including 6 dreadnoughts, and he had crushed rebellions on 17 worlds, and he expected this to be the easiest campaign of his career. Commander, his tactical officer reported, and we are approaching the Sol system, and should we prepare weapons? Not yet, Dravok replied with calm confidence, and we will show them our strength first, and let them see what they face, and most species surrender. Once they understand the futility of resistance, the fleet dropped out of FTL travel at the edge of Earth's solar system, and sensors immediately detected the human defensive perimeter, and it was laughably weak, and scattered stations and patrol craft, and nothing that could threaten even a single Valorian destroyer broadcast the ultimatum on all frequencies. Dravok ordered. The message was simple and clear, and humanity had 24 Earth hours to accept protectorate status or face the consequences, and there would be no negotiation and no compromise, and the Imperium's patience had reached its end. Response came within 3 hours. It was a single word transmitted from Earth itself and broadcast across every human vessel and every station and every colony. No, Dravok felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, and was it concern? And he dismissed the thought immediately, because these primitives could not possibly pose a threat. Begin the pacification operation, he commanded. What happened next would be analyzed by military historians for generations and studied in tactical academies across the galaxy and remembered as the moment. Everything changed. The humans did not flee, and they did not surrender, and instead, every ship and every station and every armed satellite opened fire simultaneously. Drek watched in shock as his shields flared under impact, and the weapons were primitive. Yes, but there were so many of them, and the humans were throwing everything they had into the fight. Evasive maneuvers, he shouted, as a human destroyer on a collision course with his flagship refused to change trajectory, even as Valorian weapons tore it apart, and the ship's reactor detonated against the Eternal Dominion shields and dropped them by 30% in a single instant across the battlefield. Human ships fought with a ferocity that defied logic, and they rammed when their weapons failed, and they detonated their own reactors to damage Valorian vessels, and they protected each other with coordinated tactics that seemed impossible for such a young, spacefaring species. 3 hours into the battle, Dravok lost his first dreadnought 6 hours, and he lost 2 more when the remnants of Battle Group 7 retreated back into FTL, The Valorian Imperium had lost 19 ships, including 4 dreadnoughts, and suffered catastrophic damage to another 12 vessels. Drevok stood on his battered bridge and stared at the damage reports with incomprehension. Humans had lost over 60 vessels and thousands of their people, but they had won. And as news of the defeat spread across the Imperium, a single question began to echo through every council chamber and every military base and every vassal world. What had they just declared war on? The emergency session of the Grand Council convened in a chamber that had never known the taste of military defeat, and High Counselor Varath sat rigid in his throne while holographic displays showed the wreckage of Battle Group 7 floating in the dark between stars. Impossible. Counselor Marana whispered for the 100th time, and her 6 arms trembling, and this cannot be real. But the data did not lie, and 19 Valorian warships destroyed, and 12 more crippled, and Fleet Commander Drevok himself stood before them with his uniform scorched and his pride shattered. Explain this disaster, Varath commanded, and his voice cold enough to freeze atmosphere. Adra struggled to find words that would not sound like excuses. The humans fought without regard for their own survival, honored High Counselor, he began, and they employed tactics we have never encountered, and ramming attacks and reactor detonations and coordinated strikes that sacrificed their own vessels to damage ours. And when we destroyed their ships, they celebrated if it meant taking one of ours with them. Celebrated? Jean's serpentine body recoiled in confusion, and they celebrated their own deaths? Yes, Counselor. Dravok confirmed, and we intercepted their communications, and when one of their destroyers successfully rammed our dreadnought, Unbreakable, will the other human vessels broadcast messages of congratulation to the dying crew, and the crew responded with what our translators rendered as pride and acceptance. The council members exchanged troubled glances because this behavior fell outside all known parameters of rational species conduct, and self-preservation was the most fundamental biological imperative, and these humans seemed to ignore it entirely. I want answers, Varath declared, and summoned the Science Directorate, and I want to know everything about these creatures and their biology and their psychology and their history, and I want to know why they fight like nothing we have ever seen. Within days, the most brilliant xenobiologists and military analysts in the Imperium gathered on Valora Prime, and they studied every scrap of data collected from human space and intercepted broadcasts, and captured equipment and the bodies of human soldiers recovered from destroyed ships. Chief Xenobiologist Kelmuth presented his findings to a packed auditorium of military commanders and government officials. What we have discovered challenges our understanding of evolutionary biology, Kelmuth began, and his voice carrying a mixture of fascination and horror, and the humans evolved on what we would classify as a Class 12 death world. Gasps echoed through the auditorium because Class 12 represented the highest danger rating, and worlds where almost everything was actively trying to kill you. Their planet generates massive storms that can flatten entire forests. Kelmuth continued as images of Earth's weather patterns filled the display, and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions occur regularly, and their oceans contain predators of enormous size and ferocity, and their land masses host thousands of species of venomous creatures and parasites and diseases. How did they survive to develop intelligence? Someone asked from the audience. That is the truly remarkable part, Kelmuth replied, and they survived by becoming the apex predators of their entire planet. And humans are what we call persistence hunters, and they cannot run as fast as their prey, but they can run longer, and they chase their prey for hours or even days until the animal collapses from exhaustion, and then they kill it. A hologram showed human hunters from their primitive past tracking a large animal across vast distances. Their cardiovascular system is extraordinarily efficient, Kelmuth explained, and their ability to regulate body temperature through sweat allows them to function in conditions that would kill most species and their pain. Tolerance is beyond anything we have measured, and we recovered the body of a human soldier who had sustained injuries that should have rendered them unconscious, but combat logs show they continued fighting for another 17 minutes. The audience sat in stunned silence. Furthermore, Kelmuth continued, and his voice dropping, and humans possess a chemical compound in their bodies called adrenaline, and when threatened or injured, their bodies release this compound, and it temporarily increases their strength and speed and pain tolerance, and essentially, they become more dangerous when wounded. That violates basic biological logic, protested one of the military analysts. Yes, it does. Kelmuth agreed, but evolution on Earth rewarded this trait, and a human who could fight harder when injured was more likely to survive and pass on their genetics, and the result is a species that becomes more lethal the more desperate their situation. Military commander Thrace stood from her seat, and her face troubled. What about their psychology? She demanded, and why do they not value their own survival? Kelmuth nodded and gestured for his colleague to take over. Psychologist Ven approached the podium, and his expression grim. Human psychology is shaped by something they call pack bonding, Ven explained, and in their evolutionary history, humans who worked in groups survived, and those who abandoned their group died, and this created incredibly strong social bonds, and humans will die for their pack, their family, their tribe, their nation without hesitation, because from an evolutionary perspective, saving the group ensures the survival of shared genetics, but they were dying for strangers. Commander Thrace argued, and those ship crews did not share genetics. To humans, the definition of pack has expanded to include their entire species. Ven replied, and they view all humans as part of their tribe, and they extend this bonding to their comrades and their nation and their species as a whole. And when we attacked their homeworld, we attacked every human's pack, and there is nothing more dangerous in their psychology than a threat to the pack. The implications settled over the auditorium like a shroud. You are telling us, High Counselor Vareth said slowly from his seat in the front row, and that we have declared war on a species that evolved to never give up, and to fight harder when wounded, and to die willingly for their group? Yes, honored High Counselor. Kelmuth confirmed. Show me their military history. Vareth commanded the display changed to show a timeline of human warfare stretching back 10,000 years. They have been fighting wars against each other for their entire recorded history. Military analyst Corvin explained as he took the podium, and they have developed tactics and strategies and weapons through constant conflict, and they know warfare in a way that species who have been peaceful for millennia cannot comprehend. The timeline showed conflict after conflict and wars that consumed entire continents and weapons of horrifying, destructive power. They have fought with swords and spears and chemical weapons and nuclear weapons and biological weapons, and they have besieged cities for years, and they have crossed oceans to fight enemies, and they have developed military doctrine through actual combat experience rather than simulation and theory. They dropped nuclear weapons on themselves? Counselor Marana asked in horror as the display showed mushroom clouds rising over human cities. Yes, Corvin confirmed, and then they built more nuclear weapons and developed doctrines for using them and created systems to ensure they could still fight even after nuclear exchange, and they have contemplated their own extinction and decided that some things were worth that cost. The chamber fell silent as the assembled leaders of the Imperium absorbed this information. What do we do? Zarn finally asked, and his voice small. High Counselor Vareth stood slowly, and his ancient eyes scanning the room. We correct our mistake, he declared, and we commit 3 full battle fleets to the subjugation of Earth, and we will crush them with overwhelming force. And we will show them that determination is no match for superior technology, and the Imperium does not retreat, and the Imperium does not surrender, and we will prevail. The council members nodded in agreement, though their confidence was shaken. But as they filed out of the auditorium, Chief Xenobiologist Kelmuth remained behind and stared at the display showing human history. He had not told the council everything, had not mentioned the human saying he had found repeated throughout their literature and their military doctrine and their cultural identity. Humanity does not go quietly into the night. Kelmuth feared that the Imperium was about to learn what that meant. 3 full battle fleets represented the largest military deployment in Valorian history, and over 300 warships and 50,000 soldiers, and enough firepower to sterilize a planet. As they prepared for departure, Kelmuth sent a private message to his family. "I fear we have made a terrible mistake," he wrote, "and we attacked their home, and we threatened their pack. And now we will face creatures that evolution designed to never stop fighting. And I hope I am wrong, and I hope our technology will be enough. But I remember the look in the eyes of those dead human soldiers we studied, and they were not afraid, and they were determined. And how do you defeat an enemy that does not fear death?" The fleets launched toward human space, and across the galaxy, other species watched and waited because everyone wanted to see if the impossible could happen twice. Everyone wanted to know if humans could win again. Ambassador Kalira of the Netherian Confederacy sat in her private quarters aboard the diplomatic station orbiting Valorian space and watched the news feeds with growing alarm. And the Netherians had been part of the Imperium's sphere of influence for 800 years, and they knew better than anyone what Valorian military might could accomplish yet. Here she was watching footage of human vessels engaging 3 full Valorian battle fleets, and the humans were winning not easily and not without terrible cost, but they were winning. Kalira switched between news channels, and each one showing different perspectives on the conflict that had now raged for 6 months, and Valorian propaganda claimed inevitable victory, but the independent observers told a different story. Human forces have repelled the Imperium's advance into the Proxima sector, one neutral broadcaster reported, and Valorian casualties are estimated at 70 ships, with 15 more severely damaged, and human losses are believed to be higher, but exact numbers are unavailable. Kalira paused the feed and studied the tactical display. The Valorians had superior shields and superior weapons and superior, faster-than-light drives. But the humans had something else. They had creativity. A message alert chimed, and Kalira opened it to find a communication from Ambassador Thorn, representing the Celestian Union, and another species that lived under Valorian dominance. "Are you watching this?" The message read, "Yes." Kalira typed back, and "It seems impossible. They are using our tactics against them." Thorn replied, and the humans studied Valorian combat doctrine and found every weakness and every predictable pattern, and they exploit it ruthlessly. Kalira had seen the reports, and humans hacked Valorian targeting systems, and humans laid mines in FTL travel routes, and humans launched false retreat maneuvers to draw Valorian ships into ambush positions, and humans weaponized asteroids and debris fields, and everything else they could find. The Imperium has never faced an enemy like this. Kalira sent back, "No one has." Thorn agreed. Across the galaxy, on dozens of worlds and hundreds of stations, other species were having similar conversations, and the Valorian Imperium had seemed invincible for so long that the mere possibility of their defeat was revolutionary. On the mining world of Kresh, 7 workers gathered in secret to watch uncensored news feeds. "Look at that." One miner breathed in awe as footage showed a human cruiser taking catastrophic damage but continuing to fire until its reactor went critical, and took 2 Valorian destroyers with it. "They do not stop." Another whispered, "Would you?" A third miner asked, "And if someone attacked your home world? If someone threatened to enslave your entire species?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications, because every species in the chamber lived under Valorian control, and every one of them remembered when their own worlds had been given The same choice the humans had rejected and join or be conquered. We surrendered. The first miner said quietly, and we saw their fleets and we knew we could not win, and so we surrendered. The humans did not surrender. Someone pointed out. No, agreed the miner, and they did not. The conversation died, but thoughts continued. And dangerous thoughts about freedom and resistance and the possibility that the Valorians were not invincible after all. Meanwhile, in human space, the war had transformed society completely. General Sarah Chun stood in the war room deep beneath Earth's surface and studied the holographic display showing the current state of the conflict. And every human colony and every station and every ship was now part of the war effort. Production reports. She commanded. Her aide stepped forward with a datapad. Shipyards are operating at 300% capacity, he reported, and we are launching a new destroyer every 18 hours and cruiser. Production has increased by 400%. And the civilian conversion program has added another 600 vessels to our fleet, though most are lightly armed. Chen nodded grimly, and the cost was staggering, and entire economies have been converted to wartime production, and luxuries had disappeared, and rationing was universal. But humanity had accepted the burden without complaint. Casualties? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Total military deaths now exceed 2 million. Her aide replied in his voice carefully neutral, and civilian casualties from a Valorian orbital bombardment of our colonies are estimated at 500,000. 500,000 civilians dead because the Valorians had decided to target population centers when military victories proved too difficult. Chun felt the familiar rage burn in her chest, but she channeled it into focus. What is the status of Operation Checkmate? Her aide smiled grimly. The Valorian supply lines are stretched thin, General, and they are pulling resources from their vassal worlds to maintain the fleet, and our intelligence suggests growing unrest among the subject species. Good, Chun said. And circulate information about our war effort to those worlds, and let them see that resistance is possible, and let them know we are fighting for our freedom, and we will not stop. It was a gamble, but Chen understood that this war would not be won purely through military might, and the Valorian Imperium was too large and too powerful to defeat ship for ship. But empires built on subjugation had a weakness. They relied on the conquered to stay conquered. 3 months later, the first cracks appeared. The Draxian collective, which had been part of the Imperium for 4 centuries, formally protested Valorian resource extraction from their worlds. The protest was peaceful and diplomatic and carefully worded, but it was still a protest. The Imperium responded with threats, but not action, because they needed those resources for the war effort. Then the Celestian Union delayed shipments of refined metals, citing technical difficulties at their processing facilities. Again, Valorians could do nothing without diverting military resources from the human front. Ambassador Kalira watched these developments with careful hope. She began holding private meetings with other ambassadors and conversations about trade and cultural exchange that were really about something else entirely. The humans have shown us something important, she told a gathering of representatives from 12 species, and they have shown us that the Imperium can bleed. What are you suggesting? Asked the Telcani ambassador, and his voice nervous. I'm suggesting nothing, Kalira replied carefully. And I am merely observing, and the Valorians cannot fight a war on multiple fronts, and they are struggling against a single species. And what would happen if that species was not alone? The implications were clear, though no one spoke them aloud back. In the war zone, the character of the conflict was shifting. Valorian fleet commander Halak stood on the bridge of her flagship and reviewed tactical reports with growing frustration. The humans had adapted to every strategy the Imperium employed. When the Valorians used long-range bombardment, the humans deployed stealth mines. When the Valorians attempted orbital superiority, the humans launched ground-based missiles that saturated their defenses. When The Valorians tried to cut supply lines. The humans simply built new factories on asteroids and moons. They are like a virus. Alax muttered, and no matter how many we kill, more appear. Her tactical officer nodded grimly. Intelligence reports that human recruitment has actually increased since the war began, he said, and their population views this as an existential threat, and they are volunteering in record numbers. Alax stared at the display showing human defensive positions around their core worlds. Prepare for planetary assault on Tau Ceti 3, she ordered, and if we cannot win in space, we will take their colonies on the ground. The battle for Tau Ceti 3 would become legendary. 20,000 Valorian soldiers descended on a colony of 300,000 humans, and the Imperium expected quick victory because ground combat was supposed to favor their superior armor and weapons. What they found instead was a nightmare. Every building was fortified, and every street was trapped, and every civilian was armed. The humans did not wear uniforms because everyone was a soldier. Children ran messages between defensive positions and elderly civilians. Manufactured ammunition in basement factories, and medical staff treated wounded fighters, then picked up weapons. Them Valorian soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy that looked like non-combatants until they opened fire. We cannot distinguish between civilians and soldiers, one Valorian commander reported frantically, and they all fight. The shopkeepers, the teachers, everyone. The battle raged for 3 weeks. When it ended, the Valorians held the capital city and nothing else. 15,000 Valorian soldiers were dead. The humans had lost over 100,000, but Tau Ceti 3 had not surrendered. The Valorian fleet withdrew, leaving their ground forces without support within a month. The remaining Valorian soldiers on Tau Ceti 3 surrendered. 4. The first time in recorded history, a Valorian military force had surrendered to an enemy. The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire. In the Grand Council chamber on Valora, Prime High Council of Varath sat in silence as reports flooded in. His generals were requesting more ships and more soldiers and more resources. His vassal species were becoming restless. The economy was straining under the war effort, and the humans showed no signs of stopping. What do we do? Counselor Marana asked, and her voice Malvareth had no answer, because, for the first time in 3,000 years, the Valorian Imperium faced the possibility of defeat, and the entire galaxy was watching to see what would happen next. 2 years into the war, the Valorian Imperium was dying, and not from a single catastrophic defeat, but from 1,000 smaller wounds that would not stop bleeding. High Counselor Varath stood alone in his private observatory and watched the stars that had once represented his empire's dominion, and now each one seemed to mock him with the possibility of rebellion. The numbers were undeniable. Needy 7 warships lost and hundreds more damaged beyond immediate repair. 400,000 soldiers dead or missing. 8 colonies abandoned due to human raids, and the humans kept coming. General Sarah Chun reviewed the latest intelligence reports from her command center on Earth and allowed herself a thin smile. The Valorian Fifth Fleet has withdrawn from the Arcturus sector, her intelligence officer reported, and they are consolidating forces around their core worlds. They are retreating, Chun observed. Yes, General. The officer confirmed, and our projections show they can no longer maintain offensive operations, and they are shifting to defensive posture. Chun nodded slowly because this was the moment she had been working toward for 2 years, and the Imperium had superior technology, but humanity had superior will, and eventually will breaks technology. Prepare. Operation Hammer? She commanded Operation Hammer was humanity's first large-scale offensive into Valorian Space 20 battle groups totaling over 400 ships. Would strike simultaneously at Valorian mining operations and supply depots in secondary colonies. The goal was not conquest, but disruption, and every resource the Valorians spent defending their territory was a resource not spent attacking Earth. The offensive launched with devastating effectiveness. Human ships appeared without warning in systems. The Valorians had considered secure and destroyed infrastructure and withdrew. Before reinforcements could arrive, a Valorian commanders found themselves playing defense across dozens of systems simultaneously. This is impossible. Fleet Commander Dravok protested during an emergency military council, and he had survived the first battle with humanity and now commanded the defense of the northern sectors. And we cannot be everywhere at once and the humans attack and disappear, and attack somewhere else before we can respond. They are using our own faster-than-light advantage against us. Military analyst Corvin explained grimly, and they studied our response times and our fleet deployment patterns, and they attack where we are not and leave before we arrive. Ben, we need more ships. Dravok insisted. We have no more ships, Supreme. Commander Thelarch replied, and his voice hollow, and every vessel we possess is already deployed, and we are pulling from defense forces and patrol groups, and we have nothing left in reserve. The silence in the council chamber was deafening. Meanwhile, on the vassal world of Celestia, Prime Ambassador Thorn stood before a gathering of his people's planetary council. The time has come, he declared, and his voice carrying across the assembly hall, and the Valorians are weak, and they are bleeding resources and attention in their war with humanity, and they cannot respond to challenges from within their own empire. You speak of rebellion, Council Leader Marith said carefully. I speak of freedom, Thorn corrected, and I speak of reclaiming what was taken from us 8 centuries ago, and our right to govern ourselves, and the humans have shown us that the Imperium can be beaten. And they have paid for that lesson in blood, and now we can use it. The vote was close, but it passed. Celestia Prime declared independence. The Valorian response was predictable, and they sent a battle group to restore order, but the battle group was undermanned and under-equipped because most of the fleet was fighting humans. The Celestians had been preparing for this moment, and they had weapons hidden away for generations, and they had trained in secret, and they had learned from watching humanity fight. The Battle of Celestia Prime lasted 3 days. When it ended, the Valorian battle group was in full retreat, and 5 more species declared independence within a week. High Counselor Vareth watched his empire fracture in real time. This is the humans' fault, Counselor. Marana insisted at yet another emergency session, and they started this, and they encouraged the others to rebel. No, Vareth said quietly, and his voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding, and this is our fault, and we built an empire on subjugation, and we maintained it through fear, and the humans showed everyone that we could be defeated, and they showed everyone what determination could accomplish, and now we are paying the price. What do we do? Zarn asked. We survive, Vareth replied, but survival meant making choices no one in the chamber wanted to make on Earth. General Chun received the intelligence reports about the rebellion spreading through Valorian space. The Celestians have secured their home system, her aide reported, and the Draxians have joined them in declaring independence, and the Netherian Confederacy has announced they are withdrawing all support from Valorian military operations, and at least 8 other species are showing signs of organizing resistance. Chun felt a grim satisfaction, but no joy, because too many humans had died to reach this point, and the war was not over yet. What is the status of our offensive? She asked. We've destroyed 47 Valorian installations across 12 systems, the aide replied, and casualties were lighter than projected, and the Valorians seem unwilling to commit forces to defend secondary targets. They are choosing their battles, Chen observed, and they know they cannot fight everywhere, so they are pulling back to core territories. It was a sound strategy, but it meant conceding vast areas of space to humanity and their allies. Send a message to the Celestian leadership, Chun ordered, and inform them that Earth recognizes their independence and we are willing to provide military support if they need it. The aide nodded and hurried away. Chen turned back to the strategic display and studied the shifting map of galactic power. The Valorian Imperium still controlled the most advanced technology and the largest concentration of military force, but empires did not fall in single battles. They fell through exhaustion and economic collapse and loss of will. The Valorian Imperium was exhausted. 6 months later, human forces launched their most daring operation yet. Operation Spearpoint called for a direct assault on Valora Prime itself, not to conquer the planet, but to prove it could be reached while human. Battle groups jumped into Valorian home system and fought their way past orbital defenses while the entire galaxy watched. The battle was brutal and humanity lost 38 ships, but 3 human cruisers managed to achieve low orbit over Valora Prime. They bombarded military installations for 17 minutes. Then they withdrew. The message was clear, and Earth could reach the Valorian home world, and if they could reach it, they could destroy it. High Council of Verith stood in the ruins of the Planetary Defense headquarters and watched smoke rise from the crater where the Western Wing had been. Building had stood for 4,000 years. Now it was rubble, honored High Counselor. A messenger approached nervously, and the Grand Council is requesting your presence. Verith knew what the council would say. What they had to say: the war was lost not through conquest but through unsustainability, and the Imperium could not maintain the war effort, and could not hold their vassal species, and could not protect their own home world. Within the week, the Valorian Imperium transmitted a message to Earth on all frequencies. They requested negotiations. General Chun read the message 3 times to be certain she understood correctly. They want to surrender? Her aide asked incredulously. They want to negotiate. Chun corrected, and which means they know they have lost but want to salvage what they can. What do we do? Chun thought about the 2 million human soldiers who had died and the 500,000 civilians killed in orbital bombardments, and the families torn apart and the childhood stolen by war. She thought about the Celestians and Draxians and all the other species who had found courage to fight for their freedom because humanity showed them it was possible. She thought about what kind of galaxy she wanted to leave behind. We accept their request for negotiations, she said finally, but on our terms, and we meet on neutral ground, and they come to us and not the other way around. The aide nodded and moved to send the message. Chun looked out the window at Earth's sky and wondered if the people who had sacrificed so much would accept anything less than total victory. But total victory meant more war and more death and more suffering. Humanity had proven its point. They had declared war on the galaxy's most powerful empire, and they had won. Now came the harder part in building the peace, because winning the war was only the beginning. The negotiations took place on Station Gamma 7 in neutral space between Valorian and human territory, and representatives from 40 different species gathered to witness the end of the war that had changed the galaxy forever. General Sarah Chun led the human delegation, and she wore her military uniform with its rows of medals earned through blood and sacrifice, and behind her stood representatives from every human colony and every branch of their military. High Counselor Verith led the Valorian delegation, and he looked diminished somehow, as if the war had physically aged him, and the proud crystalline being who had ordered the subjugation of Earth now approached the negotiating table with visible reluctance. The neutral mediator called the session to order. We are here to formalize the terms of peace between the Valorian Imperium and the Human Systems Alliance, the mediator announced, and High Counselor Verith has the floor. Verith stood slowly, and his gaze swept across the assembled delegates before settling on General Chun. The Valorian Imperium acknowledges that our conflict with humanity has reached a conclusion unfavorable to our interests. He began, and his translator, rendering his words with formal precision, and we are prepared to discuss terms. Chun stood, and her expression unreadable. The Human Systems Alliance has prepared a list of non-negotiable requirements for peace. She stated, and first, the Valorian Imperium will formally recognize the sovereignty and independence of all human worlds and colonies, and no Valorian vessel will enter human space without explicit permission. Vareth nodded stiffly because he had expected this. Second, Chun continued, and the Imperium will pay reparations for damage inflicted on human civilian populations during the war, and the amount will be determined by an independent tribunal, but will be substantial. Again, Vareth nodded, though his posture showed the pain of accepting such terms. Third, and Chun's voice hardened, and the Valorian Imperium will acknowledge the right of all species currently under their control to determine their own futures, and this includes the right to independence without military interference. This brought shocked murmurs from the assembled delegates because Chun had just demanded the dissolution of the Imperium as a political entity. That is unacceptable. Councillor Murata protested, and rising from her seat, and you are demanding the destruction of our civilization. No, Chun replied calmly, and we are demanding that your civilization be rebuilt on something other than the subjugation of others. And your species will survive, and your culture will continue, but your empire built on conquest must end. Vareth raised a hand to silence Murata. If we agree to these terms, he asked, then what assurance do we have that humanity will not simply take our place as galactic overlords? Chun had been waiting for this question. We have no interest in empire, she stated, and we fought this war because you gave us no choice. And we fought for our freedom and not for conquest. And once this is settled, humanity intends to return to our own space and pursue peaceful development. Then, who will maintain order? Vareth pressed, and the galaxy needs structure, and without the Imperium there will be chaos and piracy and war between smaller species, which is why our fourth requirement, Chen replied, and is the establishment of a galactic federation based on principles of mutual defense and cooperation and equal representation. She activated a holographic display showing the proposed structure. Every species gets representation regardless of size or power, Chun explained, and disputes are resolved through arbitration rather than warfare, and military forces are pooled for mutual defense against external threats but cannot be used for internal conquest, and species retain sovereignty over their own worlds while contributing to collective security. The chamber erupted in discussion because this was something genuinely new, and empires had risen and fallen across the galaxy for millennia, but always they were built on hierarchy and dominance. Chun was proposing something different. Ambassador Kalira of the Netherian Confederacy stood from the observer section. The Netherian people support this proposal, she declared, and we have lived under Valorian dominance for 800 years, and we watched humanity fight for their freedom. And we found our own courage to do the same, and we would welcome a galactic order based on cooperation rather than subjugation. Ambassador Thorn of the Celestian Union stood as well. Celestia stands with the humans, he announced. One by one, representatives from species that had recently broken free from the Imperium voiced their support. Vareth watched his empire dissolve before his eyes and felt the weight of history pressing down on him. If we refuse these terms, he asked quietly. Chun met his gaze steadily. Then the war continues, she replied, and more of your people die, and more of mine die, and more of your vassal species rebel, and eventually your Imperium falls anyway, but with far more bloodshed. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Vareth spoke. The Valorian Imperium accepts your terms. The words seemed to cost him something fundamental, but he spoke them clearly so there could be no misunderstanding. The chamber erupted in reaction, and some species celebrated while others sat in shock, and history had just pivoted on a single sentence. Over the following months, the difficult work of implementation began. The Valorian military withdrew from dozens of systems and species that had been subjugated for centuries, suddenly found themselves free. Not all. Transitions were peaceful, and old grudges led to violence in some sectors and criminal elements filled power vacuums in others. But humanity kept its word, and they provided military assistance to struggling new governments, and they mediated disputes between formerly subject species, and they helped establish the infrastructure for the new Galactic Federation. General Chun retired from active military service and took a position as Earth's first ambassador to the Federation. She stood in the Grand Assembly Hall on Federation Station, Alpha, and watched as representatives from 147 species gathered for the inaugural session. It was chaos, and species that had never worked together as equals now had to learn cooperation. And old hatreds surfaced frequently, and procedural questions consumed hours of debate, but it was beautiful chaos because it was. Free Ambassador Kalira approached Chen during a recess. "Thank you," the Netherian said simply. "For what?" Chun asked. "For showing us that resistance was possible," Kalira replied, "and my people had given up hope, and we had accepted our place in the Imperium. And then you said no, and you fought, and you won, and you reminded us that freedom is worth the cost." Chun smiled sadly. "The cost was very high," she said quietly, "and 2 million of my people died, and I carry every one of those deaths with me. They did not die in vain," Kalira assured her, "and they died so the billions could be free, and that is a legacy worthy of remembrance." Back on Earth, monuments were being constructed to honor the fallen, and cities rebuilt what had been destroyed, and families tried to piece together lives shattered by war. Admiral James Kowalski stood in a memorial garden where names of the dead were carved into black stone, and he ran his fingers over familiar names and friends he had commanded into battle, and soldiers who had trusted him to bring them home. A young Valorian approached hesitantly. She wore the simple robes of a student and clutched a datapad nervously. "Excuse me," she said in heavily accented human standard, "and are you Admiral Kowalski?" "I am," he confirmed, and studying the young alien with curiosity. "I am writing my thesis on the war," she explained, "and I am trying to understand, and my government tells us one story, but I want to know the truth. And how did your people do it? And how did you defeat the Imperium when you were so much weaker?" Kowalski considered the question as he gazed at the endless names carved in stone. "We were not weaker," he said finally, "and we had something your Imperium had forgotten, and we had something worth dying for." "Your freedom?" the student asked. "Not just freedom," Kowalski replied, "and we had each other, and every human who died in this war died protecting their family and their home and their species. And your Imperium sent soldiers to fight because they were ordered to fight. And there is a difference between duty and devotion, and between following orders and defending what you love." The Valorian student was silent for a long moment. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "and for what my people did, and for the war, and for all of this." Kowalski looked at her with tired eyes. "You were not responsible," he told her gently, "and your leaders made the choice to attack us, and you are part of a new generation, and one that can build something better. The Federation? Maybe," Kowalski allowed, "and if we can make it work, and if we can learn to cooperate instead of conquer, and if we can remember that strength should protect rather than dominate." The student nodded and thanked him and hurried away to continue her research. Kowalski remained in the garden and thought about the 2 million names surrounding him, and wondered what they would think of the galaxy. Their sacrifice had created 30 years later, the Galactic Federation faced its first maw.